You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NiShacks.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how you doing?
Hi, Caroline. Thanks for having me again. I'm doing great. Calling in from sunny and mountainous Chamonix in France.
Amazing. I'm very jealous. All right, let's get started. We've got so much to talk about today. Do you want to start with rates?
Yeah, let's start with the rates and what has been top of mind, especially for anybody shipping to the US the last couple of months. This rapid peak and trough that we seem to have gone through on the Trans-Pacific. And when we talk about a rapid peak, I think the best way to illustrate it is if you can pull up and show our viewers here what the NiFi index has done here over the past, for the first graph is going to be for the past year or so, just to put it in context. What we see here is initially the peak around Chinese New Year. We always have a peak. You can also see how the peak slowly subsides, normal seasonal behavior. And then, of course, we can see the peak as we get into June and July. It is a very sharp, rapidly increasing peak, drops off sharply again. If you're wondering why do we have three different curves on this one, it's because the rates here have been split into what's called Far East to US West Coast. This is China and Taiwan, so de facto mainly China. Then it's Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Now the curious part here is it appears there is a bit of a mismatch here between Southeast and Northeast Asia. So if we zoom in and look at the peak, Friday the 9th of May, this is also the last measurement before the pause on the tariffs. So that's a good starting point. And then we simply measure what are the spot rates paid after we saw it. So what's the difference compared to just before the tariff pause? And if we look at that difference on the next slide, we'll find some interesting patterns emerging. Because what we can see here is, of course, all three origins, so China, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia, have a peak. But what might be slightly curious here is Northeast Asia in particular ramps up much faster and peaks earlier. Southeast Asia also ramps up and peaks earlier than what we see in China. And what this tells us is the way the carriers dealt with this initial surge of demand was not by injecting more capacity. We've discussed this in some of our earlier podcasts. It takes time physically to put in more capacity. So when they couldn't do that as rapidly as they needed to, what they did instead was reallocate some of the capacity they already operated. So some of the space on the vessels that were usually reserved for cargo from Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, that was curtailed. And that is what then led to a very rapid pressure on Southeast and Northeast Asia rates, peaking even before we saw the China rates peak. But as we then get into July and the whole landscape changes once again, we see this peak go off very rapidly. For Southeast and Northeast Asia, the peak is already gone. And I would expect within the next week or so, we will also see the peak disappear completely for China.
So typically we would expect the peak to be lasting much longer. Right? Generally, like not just from China, Asia to the US, the peak season would normally be like May through September. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say normally I would rather say June to September, roughly, sometime even starting slightly later. And I wouldn't even call this peak the peak season. I would disassociate this one from the normal peak season entirely. This is driven by the tariff effect. First of the pause, that's what drove it up. And then the rapid return is when US importers changed their minds and said there's no point in front loading for also reasons we have discussed earlier due to the uncertainty of the US regulation. The traditional peak season, yes, that should have been well underway by now and should actually be ramping up. But we'll get to talk to tariffs in a moment. I am not sure we will get much of a normal peak season this year. Demand is relatively subdued due to the uncertainty over the whole tariff regime.
Yeah, it seems like no part of this year has been following a normal kind of trend with all the different geopolitical situations that we've been encountering.
Exactly. The carriers were quick to inject capacity. They are now removing capacity again, and there are several elements to that. One thing is, if we look at the factual base of it, we covered it a few weeks ago, where we could see in the numbers that it took the carriers 2 to 3 weeks from the point where we could definitely see demand increasing until the capacity physically was there. That's how much time it takes. Sadly, by the time the capacity then arrived, that's when the importers changed their minds and demand then collapsed. So capacity now arrived in the midst of collapsing demand. I've seen various ways of interpreting that, especially from shippers. Some shippers are claiming that the carriers to some degree were trying to gamble the market or manipulate capacity, but I don't see any evidence of that. I see carriers genuinely trying to put in more capacity in response to shipper demand as rapidly as they can. But then it's shipper demand that shifted just as rapidly down again. That's a key thing. I was looking over some of the capacity injection numbers. If we look at the week just ahead of us, the capacity the carriers are planning to operate on Asia to US West Coast in the week ahead of us is basically the same as what they planned before the tariff pause. That is a 19% drop compared to just 3 weeks ago. So this shows that within that short span of time from just 2 months ago, carriers were first injecting roughly 20% of capacity, and now they have removed that amount of capacity again in response to shipper demand. This is some extreme level changes of schedules of capacity injections and removals again that we very rarely see.
And generally for each carrier, what would 20% equate to? Is it adding maybe or removing a couple vessels overall, or I guess it just depends on the size of the carrier?
Yeah, it depends on the size of the carrier, how many services they have, right? But for some of the major alliances, you're talking multiple services per week is what it corresponds to.
Yeah, which is definitely a dramatic change. It seems like the carriers can't really win. Like, you have all your shippers wanting you to react and make decisions quickly because the market is changing and demand is changing so quickly, but you don't always, you don't get the grace of like time really to be able to see what's going to play out, and you just have to make some decisions in order to try to act as quickly as you can, and they may or may not be the right decisions.
Exactly. I wouldn't peg this necessarily in the framing necessarily of winners and losers. I would more put it in the perspective that market conditions, and again here, U.S. tariff policy is at the heart of it, it changes so rapidly that the speed of the supply chain simply cannot keep up in physical operational terms.
Yeah. I think the speed at which we're getting information too in our news is also compounding the issue. Like, you probably didn't see these sorts of things 20, 30 years ago when your news was coming through, you know, on a more leisurely basis, versus now you're just bombarded with information constantly, tweets and LinkedIn posts with news, some of it being accurate, some of it not, but it kind of presses this urgency to act.
No, but it's also been really usually trade policies, tariff policies, trade deals is usually something that evolves over a time scale of years and are rarely a major surprise when they then come in.
All right, let's shift gears into everyone's favorite topic, the tariffs. So we've gotten some updates here in the last week. Do you want to share kind of where we're at with things?
Yeah, I mean, there's been issued, I believe now, 24 letters to various countries, or in the case of EU, trading blocs, with tariff ranging all the way from, I believe, 20-25% up to 50% at the high end of it. Brazil got the 50%. Mexico is at 30, Canada at 35%, EU at 30%. Those are some of the higher levels of it. But what I would say about the letters is, if we stay factual to what do we actually know and what is conjecture, what we know for a fact is there is an executive order that have extended the pause on the old reciprocal tariffs until August 1st. So barring any other legislative action, that is what's going to happen on August 1st, the old reciprocal tariffs. What has been announced in the letters has to be then also made into legislation, which has not been done by the administration at the current point in time. Furthermore, a lot of the letters have language basically stating that these are tariffs that could be implemented unless we make a deal. So none of the tariff levels stated in these letters are a surefire thing from August 1st. So apart from all the old reciprocals coming into effect on August 1st, there's nothing that's legally certain at this point in time. And I actually pity a lot of the US importers, because this makes it almost impossible to plan what your landed costs are.
And it's interesting to see just how dramatically different the rates are with these new letters. Like, Brazil being at 50% is wildly different than previous the previous numbers. Well, we'll keep monitoring that, and next week we'll talk about it some more. All right, everyone. Well, that's been our episode. We'll be back here next week sharing more updates, but in the meantime, please like and subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're on Apple Music, Spotify, YouTube, and until next week, have a great one.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by Nice Shacks. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.